I used to think the worst kind of betrayal was loud, something you heard in the slam of a door, the crack of a plate thrown against a wall, the scream of someone being left behind. But I was wrong. The worst betrayal is silent. It happens in whispered texts at night, in shared glances across a room, in quiet absences that stretch too long. Live in Raleigh, North Carolina, and up until a few months ago, I thought my wife, Courtney, was simply going through a phase. Maybe she was stressed. Maybe it was work. I gave her every excuse because that's what love does. It turns you into a fool so slowly you don't even notice. It was her brother, Aaron, who told me. And it wasn't in some teary, dramatic outburst either. It was brutal in its calmness. We were having beers on my back porch, the kind of warm spring evening where the air smells like honeysuckle and cut grass. He looked over at me, took a sip from the bottle, and said, "Logan, man, I'm sorry to even bring this up, but I saw Courtney last week. With someone. Not a coworker. They were holding hands. I couldn't ignore it. The world blurred for a second. I laughed, this awkward, involuntary noise like a cough. You sure it was her? I asked, already knowing it was. He just nodded. I remember watching a moth batter itself against the porch light and thinking how similar that was to me. Smashing myself into something that was never going to change. Courtney had changed. That much had been obvious for a while. She used to talk to me about everything, every detail of her day, her coworkers, the podcast she liked, the weird customer at the coffee shop. That slowly turned into one-word answers in tired sighs. She started wearing new perfume, the kind I'd never seen her buy. She started turning her phone face down at dinner. She started sleeping with her back to me, murmuring just tired whenever I tried to reach for her. I let it go, told myself we were just in a rut. That's what you do in marriage. You give the benefit of the doubt. Even when it's bleeding you dry. I didn't confront her right away. No, I did something worse. I watched. I became a ghost in my own house, floating through our routines and pretending nothing was different while documenting every crack in the facade. I noticed she started going to the gym late at night, even though she hated working out. Her girls' nights became more frequent, and she never invited me to meet her friends anymore. Once, I offered to pick her up, and she nearly snapped my head off. "I've got it handled," she barked, before vanishing into the evening. That night, I followed her. I kept my headlights off and stayed back. She didn't go to the bar she claimed. Instead, she pulled into a residential neighborhood I didn't recognize. A man opened the door for her. She smiled the way she hadn't smiled at me in months. My hand shook on the steering wheel. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just sat there, staring at the house, counting the minutes she was inside. 43. When she returned home later, she smelled like sandalwood and wine. She didn't even try to lie. Just kissed my cheek and said, "Sorry I'm late." Long night. I nodded. That was the night something inside me snapped. Not like a bone breaking, a muscle tearing, slowly and painfully. I realized I wasn't married to the woman I loved anymore. I was married to someone else. Someone who wore Courtney's face and spoke in her voice, but who had no soul left for me. I started collecting proof. I went through old emails, checked our phone records, started tracking her locations using a shared cloud app she didn't realize was still active. The man's name was Brandon. 32. Real estate agent. Divorced, no kids. He looked like a cover model, broad shoulders, perfect teeth, that kind of irritating confidence you see in people who've never had to apologize for anything. I found his social media, scrolled through endless posts of him flexing in gyms and taking selfies in leased sports cars. What the hell did she see in him? Maybe that was the point. He wasn't me. The house became a war zone. We spoke less and less. When we did, it was about groceries or bills or something equally lifeless. I could feel her slipping further away, like she was preparing to disappear entirely. I wanted to confront her, to scream, to beg, but I knew that would only give her power. Instead, I planned something else, something quieter, colder. If she was going to rip my heart out and throw it away like trash, I was going to make sure she didn't walk away smiling. The first part of my revenge wasn't loud. It started with simple changes. I began hiding money, pulling small amounts from our shared account, funneling it into a separate one she didn't know about. I contacted an old college friend who worked in cybersecurity and asked him for a favor. Within a week, I had access to her full text history, emails, cloud backups. Every dirty message, every suggestive selfie, every pathetic love note she'd sent Brandon was now mine. I cataloged everything, dated it, sorted it into folders. A digital diary of betrayal. I started taking photos, screenshots of her texts to Brandon while she was sitting across from me at dinner, laughing over wine. I sent them to an encrypted drive. I even recorded one of their phone calls. She didn't know I had bugged her car. I listened to her tell him she was so close to being done with me, that she just needed to wait a little longer. I gritted my teeth as I listened to him call her baby and promise her a new apartment once she left me. They were planning their future while I was still living in the wreckage of our past. I began reaching out to people quietly. I spoke with her best friend Kayla, made it sound like I was concerned. She's been so distant lately. I wonder if something's going on. Kayla was the chatty type. She spilled within minutes. Honestly, Logan, she's been different since she met this guy at a showing. She says it's nothing, but I didn't need to hear the rest. I thanked her, played dumb, acted grateful. Another knife to twist later. Eventually, I sat down with Aaron again. I told him everything. The plan, the evidence, the timeline. I expected him to back off, to tell me I was going too far. But he didn't. He looked at me for a long time, then said, "Make her feel what you felt." And that became my mission. Not justice. Not fairness. Just emotional symmetry. I wanted her to sit in the ashes of everything she'd built and realize too late that she lit the match. That's when the opportunity came. One morning, she left her laptop open while showering. Her email was logged in. There, sitting in her drafts, was a letter to Brandon. A love letter. She was planning to leave me. She wrote about how soon the lies would be over, how Logan was sweet but weak, how she felt trapped in a life that never fulfilled her. I copied the entire message and emailed it to myself. Then carefully, I added a few sentences. Nothing too obvious, just enough to make her sound colder. Then I sent it to her mother, her father, her boss. The fallout began almost immediately. Her mom called, crying. Her dad left a single voicemail. "I'm disappointed in you." Her boss requested a meeting that week. Apparently, Courtney had used sick days to spend time with Brandon. I made sure the records showed she was somewhere else entirely. I knew she'd lie to cover it up. I made sure the lie would collapse on impact. When she came home that night, she looked like a ghost, white-faced, shaking, clutching her phone like it was the only thing keeping her alive. Did you talk to my mom?" she asked. I looked up from my book and blinked. "No." "Why?" She didn't respond. Just stared at me like she was seeing a stranger. I almost laughed. But I didn't. Not yet. What she didn't know was that the final piece of the puzzle was already moving. I had contacted Brandon. Using an anonymous number, I sent him an email filled with screenshots, GPS data, audio recordings. I told him everything, how Courtney had lied to him too, how she told me she was still sleeping with him even while dating Brandon. I made sure to include just enough truth to be undeniable. I ended the email with a note. "If you think you're special, think again. You're just the next fool in line." I waited. 3 days later, I heard her screaming in the kitchen. Brandon had dumped her, called her a liar, told her she was toxic. The door slammed. She threw her phone. I didn't flinch. I just kept eating breakfast. That night, she cried in bed beside me. I didn't touch her. I didn't speak. I just stared at the ceiling and listened to her sob. And I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Control. I filed for divorce without warning. Had the papers delivered to her office. I knew she'd open them in front of coworkers. I wanted her to be humiliated. I wanted her to feel the betrayal twist in her gut the way I had. She came home early that day, trembling, and finally asked, "Why?" That was the only word. Just that. Her eyes glossy, her voice hoarse. I stared at her for a long moment before answering. "Because I loved you. And you killed it." She moved out the next week. Took half the furniture, all her clothes, and none of her guilt. I heard from Aaron that she'd moved back in with her parents, who barely spoke to her now. I expected to feel triumphant. I didn't. I felt empty. Hollow. Like everything I'd built, the revenge, the silence, the precision, had burned away something I couldn't rebuild. I sat alone in the living room the night she left, staring at the spot where her shoes used to be.